It is the defining conflict of the modern age. It's a binary choice that has sparked civil wars, fueled nuclear standoffs, and literally poured concrete and strung barbed wire across the face of the planet. For over 100 years, the world was told we had to pick a side between two jealous gods, the free market or the planned state. Every election, every strike, every revolution, it was all framed as a cage match between these two absolutes. You were either Team Blue or Team Red. But here's the dirty little secret too, that the true believers on both sides conveniently forget to mention. Neither of these ideologies ever functioned in the real world the way they were promised in the textbooks. Not once, not anywhere. And every single time these systems were pushed to their breaking point, whether by a market crash, a global war, or a famine, the theoretical masks fell right off. Welcome to the Global Financial Historian. Today, we aren't going to bore you with the theory of wealth. We're going to look at the brutal reality of power. To really understand this fight, you have to look at the world before the fight even started. For thousands of years, the concept of economy didn't exist, at least not in the way we think of it today. There was only survival. It didn't matter if you lived under pharaohs, emperors, or feudal lords, the rules of the game were boringly simple. Wealth was land, and you got land by inheriting it or stealing it. That was it. Productivity? It was a flat line that lasted for centuries. For the average peasant, life was just a static loop of harvest and hunger, harvest and hunger. It was a zero-sum game. If I got rich, it meant you got poor. The idea that a regular person could actually create new wealth just by inventing something or trading smarter would have sounded like absolute madness to them. Then, the steam engine broke history. In 18th century England, you had this perfect storm of cheap energy, raw materials, and financial credit. It ignited the Industrial Revolution, and suddenly, everything changed. You had looms and forges doing the work of 100 men, and with the machines came a new kind of titan, the capitalist. For the first time ever, power wasn't determined by your bloodline, it was determined by your capital. The result was a chaotic explosion of stuff. Society produced more steel, more cloth, and more tools in a single decade than it had in the previous century combined. But this miracle cast a very long, very dark shadow. Cities turned into soot-choked labyrinths. The gap between the guy owning the factory and the guy working in it became a canyon. Was it efficient? Absolutely. But was it cruel? Unquestionably. That cruelty was the soil where socialism took root. And we have to remember, it didn't start as some dry government plan. It started as a moral scream. Philosophers like Karl Marx looked at the machinery of capitalism and didn't see progress. They saw a meat grinder for the human spirit. Their argument was actually pretty mathematical. They believed profit was just the unpaid wages that were stolen from the worker. So they proposed a radical flip. Imagine if the people own the means of production, the mines, the mills, the railroads. If you did that, they argued, poverty wouldn't just be reduced, it would be engineered out of existence. No more chaotic market swings. Just scientifically calculated abundance for everyone. It was an incredibly seductive promise. If you were a coal miner coughing up black dust 12 hours a day, that didn't sound like politics.
It sounded like salvation.
But here's the problem. Paper theories die hard in the cold air of reality. The first grand test of this idea happened after the Russian Empire collapsed. The Bolsheviks took over a Russia that was agrarian, broken, and backward. Basically, they tried to install a brand new operating system on a hard drive that was already crashing. They went all in. Private property? Gone. The state became the only merchant, the only banker, and the only employer. The result wasn't utopia, it was gridlock. See, without a price mechanism to tell you what people actually want, central planners were flying blind. They were ordering factories to produce millions of bolts when the country desperately needed bread. Incentives just evaporated. Why work harder if the reward is exactly the same? The economy seized up. To prevent total starvation, the state eventually had to pivot and introduce the new economic policy, basically allowing small-scale trade back in just to keep the population fed. Now, the capitalist West didn't have any room to gloat. While they were generating massive fortunes, they were also building a massive house of cards. The roaring 20s were fueled by easy credit and wild speculation. Monopolies were strangling competition, and the wealth gap reached dizzying heights. Then, in 1929, the bill came due. The stock market didn't just dip, it disintegrated. The Great Depression wasn't a recession, it was systemic organ failure. Global trade collapsed by half. In America, the supposed land of opportunity, soup lines stretched for blocks. If you were an objective observer in 1932, you would have looked at the free market and said, well, that was a failed experiment. So, by the late 30s, humanity was facing a pretty bleak realization. The planned state seemed to lead to tyranny and shortages, while the free market seemed to lead to inequality and crash. Then came the ultimate stress test, World War II. Total war demanded total mobilization. On one side, the Soviet Union proved that a command economy could weaponize a nation with terrifying speed, churning out tanks and artillery through sheer force of will and terror. Simultaneously, the United States proved that capitalism, when it's directed by government contracts and a national purpose, could outproduce the rest of the world combined. When the smoke finally cleared in 1945, the world split into two giant laboratories. The East got the Warsaw Pact, rigid centralization and 5-year plans. The West got the mixed economy. They kept the markets, but they tempered them with a welfare state, a lesson they learned the hard way during the Depression. For 40 years, we watched the data roll in. The Soviet bloc excelled at very specific state-directed goals. They were great at launching satellites and building missiles, but they failed miserably at the human level. An economy that could put a man in orbit couldn't figure out how to put blue jeans on shelves or fresh fruit in the markets. The feedback loops were broken. Meanwhile, the West evolved. Governments introduced safety nets, labor rights, and banking regulations. They didn't kill the market, they domesticated it. The result was the rise of the middle class and a standard of living that eclipsed anything the East could offer. The Cold War wasn't decided by nukes. It was decided by the fact that Western supermarkets were full and Eastern ones were empty. By 1989, the conclusion was inescapable. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own inefficiency. It wasn't an invasion that destroyed the USSR. It was the black market and the rust. A system designed to enforce equality ended up creating a privileged class of party elites, while the masses waited in line for toilet paper. The rigidity of the plan just couldn't keep up with the complexity of what humans actually need. But the story didn't end with a victory parade. With its rival gone, capitalism lost its fear, and it lost its discipline. In the 90s and 2000s, the financial sector completely decoupled from the real economy. Deregulation became the new religion. We saw the rise of too-big-to-fail banks and a level of wealth concentration we hadn't seen since the robber barons. The 2008 meltdown was a massive wake-up call. The instability of the 1920s was back. At the same time, a new generation, buried under student debt and priced out of buying a home, started looking back at socialist ideas with rose-tinted glasses. They aren't asking for gulags. They're just asking why the wealthiest system in history is leaving so many people behind. So, the debate is back, but the terms have changed. Today, nobody serious is advocating for 100% state control or 100% anarchy. The evidence is in the hybrids. Look at the Nordic countries. They are fiercely capitalistic, home to global giants like IKEA and Lego, yet they tax heavily to fund massive social programs. They use the market to generate wealth and the state to distribute security. Look at the United States, the engine of global innovation, yet plagued by crumbling infrastructure and a healthcare crisis that bankrupts its own citizens. And then look at China. The Communist Party runs the state, but fierce competition drives the economy. It's a paradox. Authoritarian capitalism. They lifted millions out of poverty by embracing markets, yet they retain the power to seize any company overnight. Step back and the pattern reveals itself. Every functioning economy today is a compromise. We are constantly blending the invisible hand with the visible fist. The uncomfortable truth is that systems don't change human nature. Capitalism harnesses greed to drive innovation, but without checks, it devours society. Socialism harnesses solidarity to ensure survival, but without incentives, it suffocates progress. The question isn't which side is right. The question is which mix actually works. History rewards adaptation. The West survived the 20th century because it adopted social safety nets. The East collapsed because it refused to allow markets. Ideology is just a map, but the territory, That's what matters. The challenges of tomorrow, automation, climate change, aging populations, they won't be solved by reading Marx or Adam Smith. They will be solved by nations that can balance the dynamism of the private sector with the stability of public investment. We've learned that markets need referees and safety nets need funding. Power will always try to concentrate, whether it's in a corporate boardroom or a Politburo. The fight is never really about the system, it's about who holds the leash. If you want to understand where the world is going next, stop looking at the labels and start looking at the incentives. For more deep dives into the mechanics of history, make sure you're subscribed.